He went undercover to check numbers, service, and discipline, but what he heard in the back hallway changed everything. A soft, broken cry echoed through the storage room, the kind that only comes from someone who has been silent for too long. A waitress stood there shaking, whispering through tears that her manager always heard her and no one ever listened. She thought she was alone. She didn't know the man standing just outside was the CEO of the entire company. In that moment, a simple inspection turned into a reckoning. What he would uncover next would destroy a powerful manager, expose a hidden truth, and change one woman's life forever. This is not just a story about business, it's about what happens when cruelty meets courage and silence finally gets heard.
The night the undercover CEO heard the waitress crying was the night everything began to unravel, quietly, painfully, and without anyone realizing that power was about to collide with cruelty. The restaurant was nearly closing, the lights dimmed just enough to signal the end of another exhausting shift, when a sound slipped through the back hallway. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was the kind of broken, restrained crying that comes from someone who has learned the hard way that making noise only makes things worse. That sound stopped him in his tracks. A man dressed in simple clothes, blending in as just another tired customer, stood frozen as the weight of that moment pressed into his chest. He had walked into the restaurant that evening expecting to observe operations, customer service, and efficiency. He had not expected to feel his heart sink with the realization that something was terribly wrong. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and standing up for those who feel powerless, take a moment right now to like this video, comment, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us that compassion still matters. The waitress didn't know she was being heard. She thought the storage room was empty. Her shoulders were shaking as she leaned against the shelves stacked with boxes, her apron still on, her hands trembling from more than just fatigue. This wasn't the first time she had cried at work. It was simply the first time someone important had been close enough to hear it. Her life had slowly narrowed into survival mode, where each shift was endured rather than lived, and each day felt heavier than the last. She had taken this job because she needed it desperately. Bills didn't wait for dreams. Rent didn't care about dignity. And when you grow up learning to endure hardship quietly, you tell yourself that pain is just part of earning a living. The man listening from the hallway was not who he appeared to be. To the staff, he was just another customer who paid in cash, spoke politely, and kept to himself. But in reality, he was the CEO and founder of the restaurant chain, someone who had built his success on values he believed were unshakable: respect, safety, fairness. At least, that was what he told himself. He had gone undercover to see the truth behind polished reports and perfect spreadsheets. What he hadn't expected was to find a human cost hidden behind closed doors. The waitress had been with the company for nearly 2 years. She had started hopeful, grateful for steady work, proud to wear the uniform. But over time, the environment had changed, or maybe she had just started seeing it clearly. The manager had a way of making people feel small. It wasn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it was a hand gripping too tightly when passing by. Sometimes it was a threat disguised as a joke. Sometimes it was being scheduled for the worst shifts again and again, punished without explanation. And sometimes it was being told that if she complained, she would be replaced within a day. She had learned to swallow her fear, smile at customers, and tell herself that enduring was better than being homeless. Her breaking point came quietly. No screaming, no confrontation, just the slow realization that she was exhausted in a way sleep could not fix. Her body ached, but worse, her spirit felt bruised. She felt invisible, trapped. And that night, alone in the storage room, she finally let the tears come because there was nowhere else for them to go. The undercover CEO felt anger rise, but he forced himself to stay still, to listen, to understand.
Power meant nothing if it was used blindly. He needed the full picture. He needed to know how something like this could exist inside a company he had sworn would be different. As he stood there, the weight of responsibility pressed down on him harder than any business decision ever had. This wasn't about profits or brand reputation. This was about a human being who felt unsafe at work. The next day, he returned, not as CEO, still undercover. He watched the manager closely. He noticed the sharp tone, the way the manager hovered too close, the way certain staff members stiffened when he entered the room. He saw how the waitress avoided eye contact, how her movements were careful, measured, like someone trying not to attract attention. The restaurant ran smoothly on the surface, but beneath it was a culture of fear that had gone unchecked. The waitress noticed the undercover customer again. She served him politely, as she did everyone, unaware that her silent suffering had already reached the highest level of the company. She didn't know that someone had finally seen her pain, not as weakness, but as a sign of something deeply wrong. For the first time in a long while, change was quietly setting its wheels in motion. That night, as she walked home under the dull glow of streetlights, she told herself the same lie she always did, that tomorrow would somehow be easier. She didn't know that tomorrow would be the beginning of everything changing.
The following days passed slowly for the waitress, each shift blending into the next. The fear hadn't disappeared, but something subtle had shifted. She couldn't explain it, but the manager seemed more cautious, more restrained, as if he sensed unseen eyes watching him. Still, the damage had already been done. Years of intimidation do not fade overnight. She continued working with the same guarded posture, the same quiet endurance, unsure whether hope was dangerous or deserved. Meanwhile, the undercover CEO was no longer simply observing. He was documenting patterns, behaviors, and inconsistencies. He reviewed internal policies at night and compared them to what he saw during the day. What disturbed him most was not just the manager's behavior, but the system that allowed it. Complaints had been buried. Exit interviews had been ignored. Red flags had been normalized as personality conflicts. Somewhere along the way, leadership, including himself, had failed to listen deeply enough. The waitress's personal life reflected the same struggle. She lived in a small apartment where silence followed her like a shadow. Each morning, she gathered the strength to return to a place that drained her because survival demanded it. She had stopped telling friends how work was going. She didn't want pity. She didn't want advice that ended with, "Just quit." Quitting wasn't an option when your paycheck stood between you and eviction. One afternoon, the manager's behavior crossed another line. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to leave her shaken. She retreated to the restroom, stared at her reflection, and barely recognized the tired eyes staring back. That was the moment she considered walking out forever. What stopped her wasn't courage, it was fear. Fear of uncertainty, fear of losing everything she had worked so hard to hold together. What she didn't know was that the undercover CEO had already made his decision. The investigation phase was over. What came next would be accountability. He scheduled a surprise corporate visit. Audits were ordered. Employee feedback channels were reopened anonymously, this time monitored directly by him. Stories began to surface, quiet ones, similar ones, painful ones. The waitress was not alone. The day of the reveal arrived without warning. The manager walked in confident, unaware that his authority was about to collapse. The staff lined up as usual, tension thick in the air. When the undercover customer stepped forward and introduced himself, not as a guest, but as the CEO, the room seemed to stop breathing. Faces froze. The manager's confidence drained in seconds. The truth unfolded methodically. Evidence, testimonies, patterns that could no longer be dismissed. The manager's behavior was exposed not as isolated incidents, but as abuse of power. The consequences were immediate and irreversible. He was removed from his position on the spot, escorted out of the building he once ruled through fear.
The waitress stood quietly among her coworkers, her heart pounding. Relief washed over her slowly, cautiously, like sunlight after a long storm. For the first time, she felt seen, not as an employee number, but as a human being whose pain mattered. The CEO addressed the staff with humility rather than authority. He acknowledged failure, not theirs, his. He promised change, not as a public gesture, but as a moral obligation. Policies would be enforced, voices would be heard, safety would be non-negotiable. As the meeting ended, the waitress returned to her station with trembling hands. She didn't cry this time. Something inside her had steadied. The weight she carried had shifted, and while it wasn't gone, it no longer felt unbearable.
In the weeks that followed, the restaurant transformed, not just operationally, but emotionally. New management arrived, trained not only in efficiency, but in empathy. The atmosphere softened. Laughter returned in small, cautious bursts. Trust began rebuilding, brick by fragile brick. The waitress noticed changes within herself, too. She stood a little straighter. She spoke a little louder. Healing wasn't instant, but it was real. One evening, after a long but peaceful shift, the CEO returned, this time openly, without disguise. He thanked the staff again, but his eyes lingered briefly on the waitress. He didn't single her out publicly. He understood that dignity sometimes means privacy. Later, she received an offer for additional support, training opportunities, and the option to transfer if she wished. For the first time, choice was hers. She went home that night and allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the fragile kind that breaks easily, but a quiet, steady belief that life could improve, that pain did not have to be permanent, that speaking up, even silently, could still change things. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment now to like the video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring stories like this to light. Before this story ends, we have one special request for you. Please comment below with a single word, heard. It lets us know you listened, you felt it, and you stood with her. The Undercover CEO learned something that year that no business school had ever taught him. Leadership was not about control, it was about care. And the waitress learned that her pain was never invisible. It had simply been waiting for someone brave enough to see it. The restaurant lights still dimmed at closing time. The aprons were still folded. The work was still hard. But something fundamental had changed. Fear no longer ruled the back hallways. And sometimes that is how healing begins. Not with noise, but with someone finally listening.